What I'm trying to say is you could possibly have many paths in this
Mhm.
life, and that you could have been an accountant when you needed to be, and that you can now perhaps be the artist because you need to be for this season, and yet again, something else, right? But the thing is, society tells us, no, you're stuck. You chose at 18 to be the accountant. You're going to
Mhm.
be that until you retire.
Mhm.
Don't
Mhm.
even try to dream for some other path. And what I would say is if you've done the work and you're like, you know what, there is something that I really want to explore next, then I would actually start to move in a way where it sends out into the universe this desire.
Today on the podcast, why do so many high achievers feel like they're never doing enough? If you've ever felt stuck on the hamster wheel of achievement, burned out from constantly chasing the next milestone, or just wondered why success doesn't feel the way you thought it would, this conversation is for you. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jenny Wang, licensed clinical psychologist, best-selling author of Permission to Come Home, and founder of Asians for Mental Health. Her work explores the intersection of ambition, family expectations, identity, and mental well being. It's so important, especially given the times. And we talk about how to untangle your self worth from your accomplishments and why so many of us are pursuing versions of success we never stop to question. I'm your host, Stephanie Lynn, and I can't wait to have this conversation with Dr. Wang. So great to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
You know, you spend a lot of time navigating or helping people navigate the idea of achievement and self worth. Would love to get a sense of how you became interested in this topic in the first place.
Mm. I would actually say that it probably is a personal entry point in the
Hmm.
sense that I think in some ways I would say I'm a recovering overachiever.
Yeah.
That I think it's something where having grown up in an Asian immigrant family, it was something that was kind of the minimum standard, actually. It was like
Hmm.
the bar was set fairly high,
Hmm.
and anything that fell short of that measurable level of success wasn't enough. And I
Mm.
think a lot of it then clinically started to come up as I saw more and more, clients of color or especially Asian Americans who were in fields like medicine, law, in corporate spaces. And they would come in completely burnt out and disillusioned and
Hmm.
questioning, how did I even get here? And what is
Hmm.
happiness and what is success? And so I
Hmm.
think that was kind of that meandering path towards this kind of focus and realizing that so many of us struggled with it.
Yeah. So much of what you just shared there is so relatable. I think not just to me, but so many folks who are probably listening to this. Why do you think your parents wanted to set that high bar for you?
Hmm. I think that especially in our family, my mom and my dad were the only siblings to immigrate from Taiwan.
Hmm.
And so in many ways, there was no safety net. There was no family support. If they didn't somehow, quote unquote, make it, then their other option, I guess, was to go back to Taiwan or to kind of figure it out on their own. And I think, especially when you go through the process of migration and there isn't a catchment support network there, you do feel a sense of fear, anxiety, and scarcity. And
Hmm.
so I think our parents, in their best intentions, kind of put on us those anxieties, those fears and concerns that if we didn't get our footing early enough in life to set us up in another country like the US, that somehow we would have failed or we would have, had a hard time just living our livelihoods. And so I think that scarcity model was ingrained at a very young age. And it's interesting. It's that scarcity model paired with a pursuit of excellence
Hmm.
almost at all costs.
Hmm.
And that
Hmm.
could be mental well being, physical health, whatever was necessary to get you to the top.
Hmm.
And I think that is part of how identity structure then begins to develop.
Hmm. So, in a way, it was the parents' way of protecting the children, trying to set them up for this very high level of success, but inadvertently also putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the
Hmm.
young person as well.
hmm And also redefining what success meant for a young person, right? I think, a lot of my clients, even just friends in our kind of age group, would say, I actually didn't study or pursue a career that was of interest to
Mhm.
me, right?
Mhm.
Perhaps they went after things that were traditionally more stable, as seen by our community or our parents. And so, we have lots of friends who went maybe the engineering route or law or medicine or what have
Yeah.
you, and now are coming into therapy and saying, I'm having a midlife crisis
Oh,
because
man.
I've done it all and I'm still not happy, right?
Wow. Yeah. So, how do you help people rewind things and help them untangle all of that?
Mm. I think there's something to be said about values based living that is really important, right? I think if you can even envision perhaps some of the values that our parents held, right, that would have maybe encouraged them to guide us in certain directions, things like financial stability can be a value system, right, that
Mhm.
we hold as kind of that primary focus. And so, from our parents' perspective, especially if they came from poverty, from war, from colonization, this idea of stability above all things, that makes sense then. Their
Mhm.
behaviors, their decisions, their guidance.
Mhm.
However, I think as a perhaps second, third plus generation, we now are in a different context, right? I even think about how even language proficiency, right? My parents could not, my mom immigrated not knowing how to answer the phone, not
Mhm.
knowing how to say anything beyond hello,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And she didn't have an educational degree. She did not have any background
Mhm.
that would give her any credibility. So, from her mindset, it was, well, then we need to, at minimum, get to that level, right? So,
Mhm.
do well in school, learn English without an accent, right?
Mhm.
All of these privileges that future generations now have. And yet, we're still stuck in the mindset that our parents might have come to these states with, right? Which
Mhm.
is we have nothing. And
Mhm.
so I think we need to revise and update some of these value systems and also say, we are not in that same place and time as our parents when they first
Mhm.
came to the States. And also, what are the values that we want to carry forward from our parents, right? I love that sense of frugality and
Mhm.
understanding financial, right?
Yeah.
Like
Literacy, yeah.
yes,
Mhm.
exactly. That is something that I hope my kids will also inherit from us one
Mhm.
day, right? So it is a balance of what is still of value and useful to us as future generations, but also what could we reinvent or reclaim from our
Mhm.
parents' insights that sets us up actually in a better position for the place and time that we're living in now.
Yeah. Yeah. But what about folks who are starting to realize all of this,
Hmm.
but they're feeling a sense of guilt because, maybe they want to take the time to pursue things that are more aligned with their own personal values, but it feels like such a departure from what their parents or people who are close to them wanted for them in the first place.
Mhm. I felt this deeply in college because I was studying to become, master's level accountant,
Mm.
CPA track.
Oh, wow.
And then it was like deep departure into psychology, which
Uh-huh.
my parents had no framework or understanding around.
Mm.
And I think what was helpful in meandering through that path with them was being very clear on the outset that business and accounting was not something that I really enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would always say, well, then what do you want to do instead? Because I think their anxiety would be triggered when I said,
Mm-hmm.
I don't love this.
Mm-hmm.
And I initially didn't have a sense of direction, right? And they probably felt that sense of, lost, being kind of lost in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And however, all along the way, I would say, hey, I'm going to take Psych 101. I'm going to take some additional psychology classes.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'm doing to kind of explore this realm. And I think that was helpful because it gave them a sense of that I had a sense of ownership and responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I was doing my part, still taking my business degree classes,
Yeah.
But I did actually drop out of the master's accounting program at that point and
Mhm.
kind of then pivoted to finance because I was so far along in my business degree. But that check in where it was like, this is what I'm doing now. This is how I'm pivoting. This is
Mhm.
how I'm adjusting. And I would say to their credit, they had to give me a level of trust, right, that allowed me to explore this other option more
Mhm.
deeply.
Mhm.
And I think there's something, especially now being a parent, where when our kids feel lost, it triggers our own anxiety, right? As a
Understandably, yeah.
parent, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think there's something that is important about the communication of, hey, it's on my mind that I'm lost. And I'm actually problem solving how to get through this and past this. That allows our parents to see, oh, no, she's not just hanging out, right?
Mhm.
Going to college, but clueless.
Yeah.
But she's actually taking these micro actions to test a theory or an optional path.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of times what happens is our parents' anxiety causes us to shut down the communication, right? It's like our
Yeah.
parents are
Mhm.
nagging,
Mhm.
or our parents are saying, are you taking this seriously? You can't just do nothing. You can't just, right, like
Yeah.
explore
Uh-huh.
forever. And we cut the communication with them,
Yeah, it's
right?
like, "How long are we gonna be doing this for?" So it sounds like, just kind of, giving them a window into your thinking and your rationale. I'm also exploring a little bit, and here's why you can trust me to make those decisions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that communication offers almost what I would say scaffolding between you and your parents to say, hey, I'm still being responsible for my life, right? Maybe I'm taking on a side job, side hustle, something to fund, right? If I'm leaving my primary job, something to fund this exploration period. At the same time, I'm not doing it aimlessly or I'm not just kind of not taking it seriously, right? I'm actually
Mhm.
putting thought into this process. Now, I say this with a caveat that not all parents would maybe approach this exploration season with perhaps the trust or openness that, let's say, my parents had. Um, and so I understand that there will be times when perhaps we don't disclose everything to our parents.
Mm.
And sometimes that is a very real reality for us too, right? Especially culturally, when those boundaries can look very different than
Mhm.
perhaps our Western, counterparts.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we may not disclose fully because we understand the impact of that disclosure on our parents.
And that's okay to I mean, I imagine some people are like they again, going back to that sense of guilt, like, I should be a good child and maybe
Right.
sharing everything with my parents, but you're saying sometimes if we want to keep some things to ourselves
Hmm.
out of self-preservation,
Hmm.
um, it's okay to do that.
I would agree. I would say that's probably true in certain family relationships, that perhaps the disclosure could activate so much friction between parent and child that it would actually could do more harm, right, than good. And I think we have to recognize our parents are fully embodied individuals of their own right. They have their own fears, their own traumas, their own anxieties. So their reactions are also not necessarily unbiased, right? They
Mhm.
have those experiences that might be activating their response to us. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes in order to preserve the parts of us that are not yet ready to be shared with them, we may not have to or need to fully disclose if it means that it gives us some space to explore and understand ourselves before we bring that version of ourselves to our parents.
Mhm. Mhm. And curious to get your take on this too. You know, sometimes I think people become really conditioned into living through someone else's lens of expectations of what life should look like, what success looks like, that it becomes almost an autopilot situation where,
Mm.
to your point, as you said earlier, folks suddenly find themselves, in in their 40s, 50s, maybe 60s, and they're like, "Oh, I don't think this is I've been living life not for me, but for someone else."
Mm.
Um, can you help us understand how people can maybe catch that moment if they might subconsciously be living that way in their lives?
I think in order to live in a way that feels perhaps misaligned with that internal kind of drive or internal self, we almost need to do a certain level of disassociation or disengagement from those deep longings and desires, right? It's kind of like if I always wanted to be an artist, but instead I was an accountant,
Hmm.
it would require psychological energy to stay in accounting with no creative outlets in other
Mm,
parts of my life, right? And you
hmm.
would feel that dissonance sometimes very profoundly, that you would then be like, this is not right. This doesn't feel right. And somehow have to talk yourself back into, right, the accounting in this example, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I would say that because we need to cope under those conditions of dissonance, we almost then have to move into a certain point of like disassociation or denial about that perhaps creative part. Because otherwise, that creative part will constantly be knocking on the door saying, why are you getting up and going to this job again?
Hmm.
Why are you still here? Right.
Hmm.
And so we kind of almost feel like we need to put that part on the shelf or in a closet in the far, far back so that we can get up and live our lives and do the days that we have ahead of us. And so, one even just micro exercise is to sit down, right, in a place, in a space in which there's solitude and silence, and just listen even to the body, because the body, I always say, doesn't really lie.
Hmm.
Right? When you're
Hmm.
fearful, the body is like, you can feel that bodily response, even if the mind is like, no, we're good. We're good.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
Because the mind is a master manipulator of getting you to where you need to go. That's how we get to burnout is we disengage from the body
Hmm.
so much that the mind says, no, we're fine. Right? And
Hmm.
yet I have stomach pain, I have back pain, migraines. The body's
Huh.
telling you something's wrong, but the mind is like, nah, we're good. Let's keep grinding. Right.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
Okay.
so I would encourage people to find space and time to just start to take a sense of like intuition and pulse. How is the mind and body living in its current state? It's kind of like that feeling where you're like, something feels wrong, but I can't put a finger on what it is.
Hmm.
And even acknowledging that there's something that feels miscalibrated is a powerful step,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so, when you're going about your day, when you're getting up and going to work, is there a sense of miscalibration, right? It's this dissonance that
Hmm.
you're feeling internally. And if there is, could you write about it through journaling? Could you talk to a friend or a mentor about it? Could you give yourself, right, the sense of curiosity about the dissonance to start to peel back what this dissonance is? Most of us don't even get to that point
Hmm.
because to be able to be willing to hold that uncertainty means that there's a possibility you may have to walk away from something in your life
Yeah.
that
And
you
that can
know
be
is not
scary.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, because you're basically you're suddenly transitioning from one identity you've spent like years developing and you've become so accustomed to, and you're taking a dip in the pool in something that might be really exciting and wonderful for you, but you're rebuilding from the ground up basically.
Yes.
Yeah. What is the guidance for folks who might be in that transition point who are like, okay, I think, I've done the exercises. I think it's time to try something new, but I don't know where to start, and this is terrifying.
Yes. Oof. And we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
Whether we were young or middle age or older, we've all been at that beginner's mind
Mhm.
before. But as adults, we start to form that identity around, especially around career or things we do. And that becomes this almost hardened shell of like, I can't begin again.
Mhm.
Who does that at 45, right?
Mhm.
Who does
Mhm.
that at 55?
Mhm.
And so I would say if you've done the work and you're like, something feels like this is not the path for me anymore. And we're not saying that it was never the path for you. What I'm trying to say is you could possibly have many paths in this
Mhm.
life, and that you could have been an accountant when you needed to be, and that you can now perhaps be the artist because you need to be for this season. And yet again, something else, right? But the thing is, society tells us, no, you're stuck. You chose at 18 to be the accountant. You're going to be
Mhm.
that until you retire.
Mhm.
Don't
Mhm.
even try to dream for some other path. And what I would say is if you've done the work and you're like, you know what, there is something that I really want to explore next, then I would actually start to move in a way where it sends out into the universe this desire. So, what I always say is tell your best friend, tell a great mentor, tell somebody, I want to explore this. Even
Mhm.
the act of saying it out loud has power, right? And whether or not you believe in manifesting or not,
Mhm.
it is this idea of something inward coming out into the world. And you would be surprised the number of times where when somebody does that and says it out into the universe, somebody says, oh my gosh, my sister-in-law does that. Or, you know what? My neighbor is in this industry.
Mhm.
And that's when the magic starts to happen, where opportunities start to open up simply because you had the courage to admit that you wanted to try something new, right?
Yeah.
And I think that in the beginning, I always say, you're just practicing. So let's say you want to be, I don't know, in the music field. Okay, then what does it mean for you to perform in front of people, for you to hone whatever musical talent you have? Let's get out there and start to do it in these very tangible but micro ways. Because part of it is we're just trying to get a feel. What does it feel like to do this? Right?
Mhm.
And maybe you do it and you're like, you know what? I hate performing.
Mhm.
Great. I'm so glad we figured that out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Mhm.
then where else do we direct that interest towards? Maybe it's behind the scenes. Maybe you're not performing. Maybe you're in music production, right?
Mhm.
But the thing is, a lot of us, we try something and then maybe we're like, oh, I didn't do it perfectly or it wasn't the way
Yeah.
I envisioned. So we
Mhm.
stop.
Yeah.
And then a year later, we're still back there wondering, could we have done that thing that we were really interested in?
Mhm.
And so the goal is to get the feedback loops to happen quickly, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe you want to be a stand up comedian, then you
Mhm.
better be going out there every weekend and doing a show, right?
Right, right,
Because
right.
the more feedback loops you get, the more data you have to
Mhm.
figure out what that next step is.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of like adults and just high performers tend to sometimes forget because, we're so used to being at the top of our game, being really good at whatever it was that we were, whatever field we were in. And then when we decide to try something new or change fields entirely and we um, start experimenting, and you're like, oh my God, like, we just forget that this is part of being a beginner, right? Like
Yeah.
making those mistakes and tripping up and making, feeling a little foolish. Like that is part of the
Yes.
process.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I actually would say across the board for all adults, find something that you kind of suck at
Mhm.
and do it. Right. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say suck, but find
That's fine.
something that
That's
you're
great.
really bad at. Right. Like
Okay.
something that you are a beginner in. And for me, it's tennis because my son was taking tennis lessons. And I was like,
Mhm.
okay, well, I'm already here. I'm going to take tennis lessons. And I watch these 10-year-old kids and they are phenomenal. And I'm over here not able to serve after a year of lessons, right?
Mhm.
And it's so humbling, but it
Yeah.
also makes you realize that practice for failure, right? It doesn't kill you. Like, my
Mm-hmm.
ego gets bruised
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't love it,
Mm-hmm.
but I realize, you know what? This is such a great practice for the discomfort of doing something that's outside of my area of mastery. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what you're talking about, is that we become masters of our field or area, and then we lose the ability to be beginners
Mm-hmm.
because we're wanting to avoid that beginner failure rate or disappointment or frustration.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to create a new path if you're not willing to embrace or at least tolerate that failure. I think it's so important to learn the value of beginning or having a beginner's mind, right? I think that's a very like Buddhist or Eastern philosophy. It's like you can be the master of so many things, and yet the ability to come back into a beginner position and to humble oneself, to set aside the ego, and to not have identity tied with constant success. That is, I think, one of the most powerful tools that you can develop because it's not just about career. It's also about how we have to reinvent ourselves in relationships, friendship, marriage, even watching our parents age, our relationship with them changes. So think about over the course of your long, hopefully, life, you will have to reinvent those roles again and again, right? And so as you do so, the beginner's mind equips you for that journey over and over again, whether it's reinventing your career, perhaps the end of a marriage,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps raising children as they age and change. You start over again and again throughout the course of your life many times. And so I think that tolerance of being able to say, I'm not going to get this perfectly. In fact, I'm going to actually get it very poorly in the beginning, and that doesn't define me.
Mm-hmm.
That's key, right? That being a beginner, not getting it perfectly, not getting it quickly, still doesn't mean that I'm less worthy or valuable, right?
Such
Which
an important
is,
message.
yeah, which is the antidote to perfectionism and overachievement, right? Because I always say perfectionism and overachievement are the beast. And to keep that going, you need to feed the beast.
Mm-hmm.
Every
Mm-hmm.
promotion, every raise, every successful IPO, you got to
Yeah.
keep feeding the beast.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, the whole system breaks down.
How can you help people who are overachievers? How do you, but are struggling with this sense of burnout and constantly having to prove themselves? How do you help them separate who they are from what they do? Is it
Mm.
possible?
It is possible, but I think it requires us to do the things that often we know we should do, but often don't. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of times it's setting boundaries around work, right? People who are overachievers or even workaholics will work when they know they shouldn't be, right? The kids are tugging at their elbows. The spouse is like, hey, I haven't even had a conversation with you for a
Mm-hmm.
week. There are signs often all around us that something needs to change, but the anxiety of not being the best or an overachiever or what have you keeps us on that wheel because we think that if we stop, people won't value us, we won't be seen as experts or successful, right? And those are all fears of what if? What if I step off the hamster wheel? Will I become irrelevant, less effective? And so, one of the challenges I have for some of my clients is okay, then let's test the what if. Let's ask your boss for one day off, right, during the week. Let's go
Uh-huh.
down part time. Let's test, right, in a reasonable and tolerable way, your deepest fear if you were to
Mm-hmm.
step back. Or
I'm laughing because, I mean, I imagine that's so terrifying for
it
some of these people
is.
who've been so like, I can't like
Yes.
take a day off.
Right. And
Yeah.
and the worst is when they're like, "I get unlimited PTO, but I
But they
never
never
take it."
yeah, they never take it. Yeah.
Right? And so this is right part of that practice of then let's test the anxiety, the fear, right? Because
Mhm,
in its worst, we blow it out of proportion. We're going to lose our job. If we don't
mhm,
work until 3 a.m., we're going to get fired, right? And in reality, the likelihood of that is often very low because people
mm,
who are often overachievers also underestimate perhaps how they're perceived or valued by their
mm.
company, right?
Why do you think that is?
Well, I always say that, right? The more you give without perhaps the appropriate recognition or acknowledgement, it doesn't, it sets the bar for everybody else very high for you. But it in fact also devalues you because
Mm,
you're willing to give so freely your time, your energy, something that the next person, right, in the next cubicle over is very protective of,
mhm,
right? And so it is in effect this idea of, you kind of get seen as okay, well, that's what she always does. So it's okay to dump everything on her because she's
mm,
not going to say no. She's not going
mm,
to push back, right? Maybe she likes working this much and
mm,
everybody else is working less. And so when you start to see your time and energy as valuable, as something that in effect needs to be kind of valued in order for it to be shown, right, and given, then you start to realize and communicate to the outside world my resources are very important and valuable, and I'm going to safeguard them, right?
mm.
And I'm not saying slack at work. Overachievers, though, don't slack at work. That's not how they live their
Right,
life,
yeah.
right?
Mhm,
They're often overworking without the necessary, right, recognition, acknowledgement, or validation. And
mm,
so they're giving away their resources for free, right? Where somebody else is saying, you know what? I can't work past 5 because I have things to do and I have a family to take care of or what have you. And they're actually guarding their time as something valuable, right? In
mm,
effect, communicating their worthiness, their value that they've placed in themselves. And so when I say boundaries, then let's talk to your manager and say, right? I'm far exceeding the number of hours that I know, right, that I'm being compensated fairly for. So, what do we need to do to make this more balanced? Because this is not sustainable. And
mhm,
when we have that conversation, we're communicating to the manager, I can't do this forever. And if you make me do this forever, I likely will have to leave this organization, right? Because it's
mhm,
not going to work, right? It's not a way to live.
mhm. So what does healthy ambition look
Hmm.
like to you?
Yeah. So I don't see healthy ambition as like numbers of hours worked, right? Because some would say healthy ambition is being willing to work endlessly without limit, right?
Mhm,
Maybe, maybe not, right? But I say healthy ambition is a combination, right, of clean fuel or energy. And what I mean by that is I'm driven to put in the time and the energy towards something because it's interesting, exciting, rewarding, valuable to me, right? And it's not driven by what I call dirty energy, like shame, fear,
mhm,
scarcity, anxiety,
mm,
panic, right? We know what it's like to be driven by that kind of energy. I'm
mhm,
sure some of us have felt that, right? Where it's like, I'm only doing this because I'm scared that if I don't, I might lose my job or I
mm,
might blah, blah, blah.
mhm,
The flip side is clean energy, which is you think about entrepreneurs, right? People who are or in nonprofits, they're willing to put in the time because there's something bigger here, right? There's this greater mission, purpose, right? Impact that they're striving for. And so they're willing to put in the time. And in fact, it doesn't feel like necessarily labor, even, right? It's something that they're willing and wanting to do. Now, I'm
mhm,
not saying that the whole part of the journey is going to be fueled by clean energy. There's the drudgery, there's the right monotony of getting things done.
yeah,
but you have this higher purpose that you're driving for, right?
Mhm.
Versus I'm doing this simply because I'm scared, right? And the scarcity mindset. So I think that's one piece is healthy ambition comes from a place where I want to do well, and I want to do well not because I fear that I'm valueless, right? Or
Mhm.
not worthy. I want to do well because this is exciting, it is of interest, it is of passion, or it has a mission that I'm committed to. And that is what I'm chasing.
What are some actionable things that people who are high achievers can do if they are
Mm,
struggling with, oh man, I think this workload might be a little bit too much, or maybe I'm taking on too many projects, or, or perhaps, I'm giving my 110%, but I'm just not getting the reception that I thought I would.
mm. I think, when I think about overachievers, it's almost like a stuck, steady state that they get in, right? It's like, I have to be an overachiever all the days of my life, times how many decades I'm working,
Uh-huh.
right? How about let's be actually very selective about when we overachieve, right? Because often with a task or a role or a job, there's the specifications of the position or role, and then there's like the over and above, right?
Hmm.
And the overachiever is the over and above all the time, right? It's like the student where it's like a 91 final grade and a 100 final grade is the same on your
Mm.
GPA,
Hmm.
but they can't help but be at the 100% for all subjects, even though it makes no difference whatsoever,
Yeah.
right? So maybe let's be a little bit more strategic about it, right? Where are the areas in which, when you are at your 150% capacity, it actually is effective in gaining you something, right? Tangible. And when the other situations where, you know what, hitting minimum specs is plenty, then let's adjust our work so that we're hitting the specifications, but not necessarily far exceeding it because it's not gaining you anything, right?
Hmm.
And so now let's actually have a little bit more nuance about how we apply that energy and that time. We're not just going to across the board say, let's overachieve 150% on everything. Let's actually be very selective. And for some industries, it's seasonality, cyclical patterns of the year, right? Like tax
Yeah.
accountants, they have to be on right when it's April,
Right.
March, February. Whereas other industries, it's pretty steady state. And if that's the case, then what does it look like to adjust how you work so that it gains you the most benefit without wasting energy in areas where there's little to no additional benefit?
Could you speak briefly to where overachievement comes from and why do
Mm,
so many people who fall in that category constantly feel like they're they're behind, they are not doing enough,
mm,
even when objectively they're doing well.
hmm. Yeah, and I think I see ties of this even in like imposter syndrome, right? Where it's like everybody else would say objectively, she's doing a great job, right? She's a great contributor, great teammate. But that person consistently shows up feeling as though they're still not enough, right? A step behind. And I would say that, there's elements of personality structure that's developed, right, through our families of origin, maybe how you were raised. Um, I can't say for sure that there's a certain parenting style that creates overachievers, right? But I
Mhm.
think ideas that are kind of ingrained in us, such as scarcity mindset, things in which you're communicated, no, this is, the whole joke of like, what do you mean an A minus? Where's the A plus, right?
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
that kind of conversation around achievement and perfection can be something that we internalize, right? Through
Mm.
parenting, through school, through all of these things.
Mhm.
That being said, there are also people who, without external motivation, hold themselves to this high standard
Mm.
for themselves, right? So it's internally driven.
Mhm.
And I also think that in many ways, right, if you think about that core question, like if I don't overachieve, then what does that mean when people look at me? Right? So it's
Mhm.
identity, right?
Mhm.
And if I don't overachieve, does that mean that I won't be valued, worthy, lovable, right?
Mhm.
And so at the end of the day, as social beings, we are trying to prevent ourselves from being hurt by our social environment that unfortunately has a lot of hierarchies that we're always trying to, right, sit at the top of, you know?
Mhm.
And so I think when we think about where it comes from, I think there's external pressures, right, to push us to be certain types of people. And I also think there's internal drive to make ourselves seen by other people as valuable and
Mm.
loved.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so when that kind of combines, and the thing is, I always say, like overachievers, they it's been successful for them. Right? Like when they've overachieved, they've gotten attention, accolades, financial or status, right? Like
Mhm.
rewards.
Mhm.
So, in effect, our society incentivizes overachievement, right? And
Mhm.
that's because we live in an industrial capitalistic society. That
Mhm.
makes sense, right? The structures are there for that. And if you think about people who have disabilities, who are unemployed, think about how society, right, relates to individuals, right, who
Mm.
perhaps for all many valid reasons cannot work,
Mhm.
right? So, of course, the structure is set up such that we're driven for overachievement, right?
Mm. Okay. So, do we move away? What
Live
what
off the grid.
yeah, what do we do?
I think that it comes down to, right, that those structures will always exist, right? But are you using those structures and working within them to your benefit? For example, right, people who stay at one company for years and years, they're always passed over for promotions. They never get the raises that they ask for. They are miserable, they're overworked, all of those things, and yet they stay, right?
Mm.
And I think that begs the question, why is this person still here? Right? And in that case, I would say that this person probably is not utilizing the system for better for worse, right? It's the reality we live in, but they're not utilizing the system in a way that benefits them, right? And
Mhm.
perhaps it is the fear around leaving the job, leaving the org, right?
Mm.
Fear of going out on their own. And that keeps them stuck there, right?
Mhm.
Undervalued, underpaid, underrecognized, you know?
Mm.
And so it's not necessarily about saying, oh, we're going to run away from all the systems. You could. That's a different way to live, right? But
Mhm.
it's, can you see the system for what it is? And there are realities such that certain teams, managers, organizations may never value you.
Mm. Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
begins a hard conversation of, if that's the case, do you still need to stay?
Yeah.
Right? And what courage do we need to have to move somewhere else where we might actually, right, receive benefit and recognition?
Yeah.
The other side of this is too that sometimes we're just fearful of even asking for a promotion, even asking for a raise, right? And so if that's the case, right, it's that the company is more than willing to give it to you, but there's not somebody advocating for you to get those bumps and
Mm.
jumps,
Mhm.
and that you're kind of required in your sense to fight for it, then what kind of coaching, what kind of mentorship from senior, right, people could we get? Or even just peer to peer organizations that can give you the skills and practice to self advocate, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a different matter if no matter how much self advocating, the company isn't going to do it for you, right? They're just not willing to move you, then that's probably a departure. But
Yeah.
it's if you've never self advocated, then we can't quite say it's the organization problem yet, right?
Mhm.
It is
Mhm.
the, ooh, perhaps I was raised to not speak up. Perhaps I was raised to not fight for what I think I deserve. Perhaps it
Mhm.
was disrespectful to
Mhm.
ask for more than your fair share, right? which is so culturally ingrained that we might not even realize that's at play.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's like a whole, a whole other area to explore here. It's like I know, I know a lot of folks who, especially from Asian American backgrounds, taught to just be in the corner and work really hard and be diligent and let the work speak for itself. And then they just get overlooked constantly. But
Yeah,
then they also never learn to speak up for themselves and advocate for their work and be able to tell a story of how they were able to contribute to the company. So they end up
right,
getting stuck in a position that, you know, they were probably overqualified for
right.
quite some time.
I would say that, right? I think like this is a whole topic of this idea of taking up space,
Hmm.
right? And I think as an Asian American female, I didn't learn that until like my mid 30s, even, right? Because
Hmm.
I think there's always this mentality of like, well, I'm just lucky to be here, right?
Yeah.
I'm willing to take whatever people give me. And I think that part of that, right, is even the physical embodiment of taking up space. Right? Like when you stand in a room, how do you stand? Are you kind of like shrinking in the corner or are you actually taking up space? Right?
Yeah.
And the psyche that that even body positioning creates in one's mind, right? And so I think there's a lot of coaching and even seeing a therapist, right, around these practices that we can start to push the edges around to teach ourselves that taking up space isn't a bad thing. And even though for some of us, it can actually create a lot of fear, right? Like I've been in, board meetings where I have to speak up and I'm often maybe the youngest person there, or I'm the
Hmm.
only Asian American female. And I, like, can feel my heart rate going up as I'm, like, putting my hand up, like, I have something to share, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But even that is a micro practice for me to learn how to show up with a voice and with the ability to take up some room, right? In those
Hmm.
very imposing and overwhelming spaces. And
Yeah.
so it is a practice, and this is why I tell my kids all the time, I'm like, everything in life is just practice, right? And if you want to take up space, we have to practice doing it because the mind and nervous system, they're always going to say, that's scary, don't do it,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And
That's
so when we
mm.
practice, we can rewire that whole system.
Yeah. And the more you do it, the more resilient you become, and then suddenly it's not so scary anymore.
That's right. Like when you're on national TV, like I'm sure you didn't start off feeling like, oh yeah, I got this, right? It
Mm.
took practice.
Mhm.
And now this is your area of mastery. And there are for sure people who look up at you and say, oh my gosh, I wish I could have that presence, right? Like
Mm.
Stephanie.
Mm.
And that was something that you just simply did over and over from beginner to expert, right?
Oh gosh, and it's still a work in progress.
Always
All the
is.
time. um, Last question for you. If you could leave ambitious people with one message, what would it be?
Oh, I would say for ambitious people, I am so inspired by you. I look at ambitious people and I'm just like, man, to have that almost like focus and drive, I am so excited for the worlds that you're going to open up for yourself. And I hope that one day you will reach a point where you say, even if all of this goes away, right? The accolades, the gold stars, the achievement goes away, you will still have a profound sense of awe in who you became in following that journey and path. Because that in and of itself has so much value that even if you don't get the gold star, even if you don't get the IPO, you are the person that you are because you chose that path. And very few choose it. So I am so excited, and I hope that you build a system so that at the end of it, you're still as excited, inspired, and driven as you were from day one.
Thank you so much to the amazing Dr. Jenny Wang, founder of the Asians for Mental Health community on social media. And check out her incredible book, Permission to Come Home, as well. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, subscribe, and follow us at O-Word Podcast. And remember, your ambition is not something to shrink. It is something to celebrate and shape. I'm Stephanie Lin. Have a beautiful day.